Hello and welcome to this short video about the following question. Outline and explain two ways in which family patterns have changed in the contemporary UK. So let's look at the structure for that question. So first of all, we're going to look at a range of ways, then we're going to focus in on two particular ways. Now, in your answer in terms of exam strategy under exam conditions, you won't need to do an introduction, and you can start writing about the first way straight away. So literally get into that by writing, one way in which family patterns have changed in the contemporary UK is divorce. And so that's how we're going to address it in a moment. But of course, there are a number of family patterns you could look at. So if you're doing the AQA exam board, as my students are, you'll be able to look in the textbook and look at reconstituted families, lone parent families, single parent families. You'll be able to look at divorce, marriage, ethnic diversity, extended families. There's a wide range of factors, patterns in terms of social class, nuclear families. So there are many factors or ways you can look at. So let's look at divorce then, first of all. So in looking at divorce, we can look at divorce and define what it is, first of all, and then we can look at why it's increased and look at the trend and talk about the trend, what the trend is and why it's occurred. So first of all, what is divorce? So divorce is the ending of the legal union between a married couple. And this has been made cheaper and easier since the introduction of several policies in the past, including but not limited to, the Divorce Reform Act 1969. So make sure you get your facts accurate there in terms of policies. You can talk about the reasons why divorce has increased since the 1960s and up to the present day, when we've got around 40% divorce rate, although in recent years that's started to flatten out and stop increasing. So generally then we've got stigma, and we can talk about the decline in the kind of negative labelling of people who go through divorce and choose to get divorced. And this is supported by a study by Mitchell and Goody. You can talk about the feminist explanation. Remember, with each concept and each point, make sure you explain it adequately in one or two sentences. Give some examples. In the feminist point to do with explaining why divorce has taken place, I could talk about how feminists have contributed to the rise in divorce because they've been critical of marriage as a patriarchal institution. Many women may have felt dissatisfied with their marriage, and therefore this could be a result of feminism and the women's rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s and so on. We could talk about liberal feminists like Somerville might argue that this is part of a march of progress where there's an increasing democratisation of family life. In other words, family life is more characterised by equality between men and women. And although there's not pure or total equality, absolute equality between men and women yet, that we are increasingly seeing a kind of piecemeal change, step-by-step change in relationships between men and women, and divorce is a sign of this. Other feminists, such as Germaine Greer, have also weighed in on this argument and argued that the high divorce rate is a sign of women's dissatisfaction with being exploited. And so this is kind of evidence for the feminist view, according to thinkers like Greer. So let's put some of those points down. So we've got stigma. We've got Mitchell and Goody. Should explain, this is my makeshift teaching apparatus in isolation. So shouldn't touch my face, but there we go. Feminists, I'll wash my hands. We talked about patriarchy. We talked about marriage in terms of a patriarchal institution. We talked about the March of Progress, the liberal feminist view, and we talked about Somerville. And we could talk about the shift in culture, more democratisation. We could also talk about postmodernists. We're probably going to use those when we talk about marriage as our second way. But we could talk about the individualisation thesis with postmodernists. Individualisation, where increasingly people have rights and freedoms to choose their relationships, their lives based on what suits their needs, making decisions for themselves rather than acting out of duty to others based on what they're expected to do. You could, if this was an evaluation type question where it says apply and analyse, 2 reasons or 2 ways in which life has changed in family relationships. An evaluation point could be, however, personal life perspective, and radical feminists could argue that there is still limits to the decisions that people can make, that divorce continues to be something that is limited by factors such as social class and gender. For example, in the case of women may commonly get custody of children, and this may affect their choice. For example, in some cases they may avoid divorce if they feel they won't be able to afford and continue to live in economic security following divorce. Radical feminists may criticise liberal feminists and postmodernists for exaggerating the extent to which women have choice, and may argue instead that marriage remains a patriarchal institution. Many women are still exploited, especially in the developing world. Okay, so let's look at the second way. So the second way in which family patterns have changed in the contemporary UK is marriage, or one way in which another way in which family patterns have changed in the contemporary UK is marriage. So we could talk about how this has changed, or what's changed. So we could argue that marriage has become less popular, so there's been a decline or a downward trend in marriage since its peak in 1972, when marriage was at its highest rate. The marriage rate is based on the number per thousand of the kind of marriageable age population who are married or get married, go through the ritual and the ceremony and the legal process. It's the legal, bonding and union between 2 people, and the religious institution as well, because it's blessed and it's within the sacred institution of the church most commonly. It's also become later, so people are marrying later in life. So why is this taking place? So we could talk about secularization. For example, the decline in the stigma and the negative labelling of cohabitation means that people are choosing cohabitation as a permanent alternative to marriage, and this is supported by Andre Beijing. We could talk about divorce as a deterrent. In other words, because the divorce rate has risen, many people may be put off from getting married because they fear that this will happen to them. So they don't want to invest and make the commitment emotionally and psychologically and economically into getting married. It's also the expense of marriage, so the cost of marriage is in the tens of thousands. There's also the postmodernist argument would be that marriage is less popular, is taking place later because of the increasing trend towards pure relationships. According to Anthony Giddens, this takes place where people are increasingly looking for a relationship that suits their needs psychologically, intellectually and emotionally, and they're prepared to delay or not get married if they can't find a relationship that suits their needs. This is something you can go into in further detail if time allows. Basically, part of this is the concept of plastic sexuality. Plastic sexuality is where there's more flexibility in terms of sexual relationships. This is partly due to contraception, reproductive technology. So women especially, but both men and women, are able to exercise more control, decisions over who, when, how, why, what sex takes place, essentially. And therefore, marriage is less of an economic security for women, and it's more of a choice for both men and women. This is also influenced by the fact that women have careers and therefore have the economic independence from men. And there is a study on that in the textbook about women, having professional independence, being able to raise women independently from men. Both men and women are living longer lives, so life expectancy is increased due to living conditions improving. And we could talk about that. There's a couple of reasons for that you could go into, briefly explain in a sentence or two. You could talk about secularization and the fact that cohabitation has increased. I think we mentioned that earlier. In evaluation of the points that we've made, we could mention that despite the argument that marriage is less popular and taking place later, despite the argument that perhaps people are looking for alternatives to marriage, people like Robert Chester, supported by functionalism, would argue that families are increasingly becoming neo-conventional. So they're following a quite traditional structure, but they are increasingly dual career families where both men and women work. And you could explain the neo-conventional family. Functionalists would argue that there's a gradual shift in family life, that there's not a dramatic and significant change in family relationships, that the ideal family type remains the married two-parent family based on a heterosexual union, fairly socially conventional. So according to functionalists, who would support this with British Social Attitudes Survey that showed most people aspire to be married. It's also supported by Chester. This suggests that other views about marriage perhaps exaggerate and overplay the extent of change to patterns of marriage and family life. So I hope this has been useful. I'll write these points up now, and if you have any questions, please let me know. So we've got marriage. We talked about the fact of the trend, where it's less popular. So there's a decline in marriage. It's also later. We talked about secularization and cohabitation. We talked about divorce as a deterrent. It puts people off. We talked about the concept of the expense of marriage, pure relationships. Goodness me, terrible handwriting. Why it's later, people living longer, and women's careers. There's so many points that I've put there that it's not possible to fit them all on that page there. Ultimately, one of the key things to remember, this is an additional point, just in terms of exam strategy, is to remember to include key points, explain them adequately, practice to exam conditions. So under time pressure, give yourself 10 or 15 minutes and just see how much you can get done. In 10 minutes you can cover about a side of A4 in my experience, and therefore you can get lots of information in, but you need to be prepared, you need to have planned this, and this is something we don't tend to like doing, but it is really a good idea. It's the best idea to get the maximum grade that you are kind of capable of and that's worthy of you. So best of luck. If you have any questions, please do let me know. Thanks.